Well, it's Academy Awards season again, and as I'm sure you're all aware, that means that the frustration it causes us has forced us to return from our COVID 19 slumber. And I know what you're thinking. We've been a little bit far and away with our reviews over the past pandemic, but I would just say we've been socially distant.
I don't know what to say.
Now, I know it's been a little while, so I think it's only fair to provide for all of you, right here, the weekend of the Academy Awards, 8 reviews of the 8 nominated films for Best Picture to walk through the good, the bad, and Mank. Mank. A historical docudrama that shows almost little insight or interest into the history that it's covering and hits on exactly all of the things the Academy loves. David Fincher, former Academy Award winners for Best Actor, and of course films about filmmakers, especially alcoholic filmmakers, who are insufferably predictable as they are just plain insufferable. Now, of course, there are highlights to Mank. Gary Oldman, as per usual, does the most with what he has. You've got some good performances by Charles Dance as William Randolph Hearst, and it's fine. It's sort of a paint-by-numbers recreation of the same thing you've seen over and over again. A writer, in this case, Mank, who's trying to author Orson Welles' Citizen Kane, the highlight of his career, many would say, is largely bedridden and constantly addled with alcohol and annoying everybody around him. Quite frankly, it doesn't have to be a bad movie, and it's got a lot of great artists who are around making it. David Fincher is one of the eminent directors of his time with films like Zodiac and Seven, among many others. He's the kind of director who you expect to bring a sort of visual style to anything that he touches. I mean, even The Social Network looks interesting, it looks compelling, it looks engaging. Zodiac, again, is a beautiful film, and he's known for capturing these great sequences with great actors, not just by having great scripts or by hiring said great actors, but by going take after take after take after take and capturing everything exactly the way that he wants it to be. Now, Mank, he tries to have a sort of visual effect where it looks almost like older film. It looks like it's been sort of degraded, some effects are added to it to give it almost a film fuzz or a film grain effect. They tried to make the film a very splendid black and white, using a lot of high contrast styles and pulling out highlights and shadows, and really creating sort of a dynamic vision of the movie. But fundamentally, it's a curious decision that they used 6K cameras to create this digital perfection, only to then strip it all down bare. I would have been much more impressed if they'd actually shot the movie on film and had sort of a naturalistic style to it. As it is, in many ways, this digital dressed down approach kind of summarizes most of my problems with Mank. It's a film that desperately strives to have style and substance, but ultimately doesn't have much of either. And while Gary Oldman is a great actor, and Charles Dance is a great actor, and Amanda Seyfried is a great actress, many of their scenes are just kind of empty and ring hollow. This is a movie that I think everybody knew before it was even made would be nominated for Academy Awards, but ultimately has no business being in this conversation. I cannot be more down on this. And again, when I'm criticizing these films, remember that it is to the standard of it's being nominated for Best Picture, right? So is Mank a horrible film? No, but it's not an interesting one. It's way too long. The scenes are not very engrossing. It doesn't seem like it really teaches us anything. If you're in any way familiar with Citizen Kane or the history behind making it, it illuminates you into nothing. And if you weren't familiar with any of those things in the first place, you're probably not that interested anyway. I mean, I'm not really sure, what pre-film school folks have both not seen Citizen Kane and both would be fascinated by the story of the alcoholic writer authoring it. I feel like there are many better movies to go back and see. And quite frankly, if I'm looking for a movie about an eccentric filmmaker shot in black and white, I go with Ed Wood. 8 days a week. Next, we have an undeniably prescient and timely film in Promising Young Woman, which deals with many aspects like our boys will be boys era that we seem to live in and frankly have lived in since as long as we've been alive, the culture surrounding sexual abuse, and the people who both enable and apologize for it. It's also an undeniably past time exposure for Carey Mulligan in the spotlight, something that she's been due for a while now. And what I think I can say about this film that I found most interesting is while it's very apparent that it is a female empowerment sort of revenge film, it does a really good job of walking a line between I Spit on Your Grave as if it were written by Gone Girl. It's a very serious and psychological approach to what could have been a very kind of simplistic revenge thriller. And I think that type of intellect behind the script enables it to be memorable, enables it to be special, and really allows for performances to shine through. Something that I find additionally impactful is that while Carey Mulligan is obviously great in her performance, and she really embodies the ebbs and flows of the script, going at times from deadly serious to almost campy comical, to this, kind of Harley Quinn appearance at the end, but she's also bolstered by some great performances by some veterans like Molly Shannon, Clancy Brown, the runner-up to the Great Highlander competition in the 1980s, but also some young actors with some good performances like Sam Richardson, Adam Brody. I think that Bo Burnham has probably one of the most unexpected breakout performances in this that really humanizes the script by allowing it to move away from sometimes campy moments of overly glossy and stylized set pieces to very human moments that allow us to understand the depths of our protagonist. And then there are other performances by Adam Brody and Christopher Mintz-Plasse, who I think take very, not even two-dimensional, but one-dimensional kind of archetypes of these abusers and gives them some body, some heft, so that their sequences don't just feel self-indulgent, they feel realistic to a certain degree. Other performances, like by Alfred Molina, do a really good job of bringing a sort of holistic humanity to the film, having characters that maybe could have culpability for this type of culture that the film is really approaching from a holistic approach, right? It's identifying not just abusers, but the people who enable them, who defend them, who apologize for them, and kind of walking through what this rage that so many of us have felt in society as we hear stories about sexual assault survivors and sexual assaulters who survive these events and face little punishment. We have tried to rationalize this rage and try to articulate to whom we should feel it. The movie does a good job of exploring the complexity of those thoughts, finding some people less culpable than others. And I think that dynamism is a part of great performances, even in brief, by Alfred Molina, by Alison Brie, who is a wonderful kind of contrast to our main character as someone who is both what our protagonist could have been had this horrible event not occurred, but also someone whose eyes are willfully bound shut, enabling her to continue as if nothing had happened. Promising Young Woman to me is an interesting and memorable film. I don't think it was one of my favorite this year, but it's absolutely one that's deserving of a watch. It's not quite as campy as I think it would be with a less patient director and an even incrementally less powerful cast, but the strength of both really enable it to steer away from camp and kind of end up in a Heathers-esque sort of mishmash of genre styles. And of course, while the sexual assault culture has been prevalent and one that has been neglected or even taken for granted in the world of film, in the past year, Black rights has been a huge issue in the Black Lives Matter movement, continuing to press to have legislative changes in the United States and a change of how we view racial dynamics in America in general. And one of the films that I think is really welcome and timely in that discussion is Judas and the Black Messiah. It's a wonderful film that we were able to see at the premiere. As it was premiering at Sundance, it was also premiering digitally at the Loft Cinema here in Tucson. We were able to go to an outdoor screening because the pandemic was so much fun and view it that way. And it is one of those movies that has a very deep cast, but ultimately it centers around four great performances: Daniel Kaluuya, Lakeith Stanfield, Jesse Plemons, and Dominique Fishback. Four great performances that really center around a human story about something that seems so much bigger than those four characters. And this is really a magic trick pulled off by its cast and crew to make such a big and grand story. The story of course, Fred Hampton being assassinated by the FBI thanks to Bill O'Neill, played by Lakeith Stanfield, and being kind of manipulated into this assassination and this trap by Jesse Plemons' FBI agent. It's a really interesting a sleight of hand, because the story of the Black Panthers is a really big and important one in American history. The film doesn't take it for granted and explores it to great depths, but it also does a great job of humanizing the characters at the center of it and the people who are in many ways their moral compasses. With Dominique Fishback for Fred Hampton performing as his girlfriend and the future mother of his child, someone who's trying to remind him of the humanity he behaves in while also trying to be a revolutionary. And on the flip side of that, Bill O'Neill being manipulated by Jesse Plemons, who is an FBI agent who himself is very conflicted as his investigation into the Black Panthers is being manipulated by a corrupt J. Edgar Hoover. And the film, in many ways, goes out of its way to explore the complexities of all the characters involved. And I think the biggest observation I had about it was thinking back to Black Klansman and how I think Spike Lee sort of had a run-on sentence of an ending, tacking on some documentary film footage and really trying to tie in the ethos of Black Klansmen to the relevant racial issues of the time, especially the tiki torches and Donald Trump, and things that I think anybody who had seen the movie in theaters would have automatically kind of correlated because they were so timely. In that movie, perhaps, Black Klansman felt a little bit melodramatic in its attempt to tie those things in, or it felt at least a little forced. Whereas Judas and the Black Messiah uses documentary film footage and the real Bill O'Neill to emphasize the complexity of the character that, while demonstrated in the movie, it's really used to an effect that ties that character together. In other words, Bill O'Neill should be in most docudramas an antagonist, whereas in this he's a very empathetic protagonist, just as Daniel Kaluuya is as Fred Hampton. And I think that's a really important thing this film does, is attempting to humanize all of its characters. At the end of the day, the film does run a little bit long. There are some things maybe I would have cut out, but largely the film is a great historical retelling of this period in history, and it does a wonderful job of examining these characters and is anchored by some absolutely great performances that I think deserve a lot more praise than they've been getting. Now, unfortunately, the flip side of Judas and the Black Messiah is another civil rights docudrama called The Trial of the Chicago 7. And I say this is so unfortunate because, as an aspiring screenwriter and filmmaker who grew up in the 90s, my Mount Rushmore of screenwriters inevitably includes Quentin Tarantino and Aaron Sorkin, the latter of which being the writer and director for The Trial of the Chicago 7, also known for his run in television with The West Wing and Sports Night, his prodigious output, writing nearly all the episodes for them, The Newsroom, and also his screenplays for The American President, A Few Good Men, and then sort of being known as this screenwriter for a hire who would constantly deliver Academy Award-winning scripts, or at least nominated scripts in Best Pictures, such as Moneyball, The Social Network, and Jobs. Unfortunately, and it pains me to say this, in the last few years, the evolution of his career has taken Sorkin to becoming a writer-director, starting with Molly's Game a few years ago, and now The Trial of the Chicago 7. And what this has revealed, to me at least, is that, like many artists, but not all, Sorkin is really somebody who needs a conduit or needs a buffer between himself and a finished product. And when I say this, what I mean is, his scripts have been directed twice by Rob Reiner with American President and A Few Good Men, directed by David Fincher with The Social Network, Danny Boyle with Jobs, and Mike Nichols having directed his script in Charlie Wilson's War. I mean, these are all great movies, and obviously he didn't direct his television shows, but when he is in charge of directing his own projects, what you lose is the narrative world built that facilitates the uniqueness of his writing. What do I mean by that? With Aaron Sorkin, any film that you watch has Sorkin beats, Sorkin one-liners. The Sorkin dialogue style is as unique as a Tarantino dialogue style. The difference is that Tarantino knows how to control a narrative, how to control set pieces, and how to control pacing, such that he really creates a unique world in which people might talk like this. Even in A Few Good Men, Tom Cruise, who is not considered to be one of the greatest technical actors of a generation, does a wonderful job taking in and expositing things in an Aaron Sorkin voice just as well as Michael Douglas does in The American President, or as Jesse Eisenberg does in The Social Network. And a lot of that is because those words are funneled through a meaning and a thematic that is controlled by the director. And as was the case in Molly's Game and now with the Trial of Chicago 7, Sorkin does not have that ability to really create scenes and create a flow and a narrative structure visually that makes the characters feel part of a real world. So the result is with the Trial of Chicago 7, while you do have good performances by Sacha Baron Cohen, Joseph Gordon-Levitt, while you've got John Carroll Lynch, you have Frank Langella. I mean, it's a great cast, but ultimately, none of the performances feel like they are characters in a movie. when they perform, it feels like small monologues or scenes about one or two characters. And as this is a story ultimately about seven defendants, or a story about a defense attorney and a racist and aggressive judge, or about Bobby Seale as the eighth defendant, unjustly at times chained by the judge to sit in silence at the desk, something that's very briefly touched on in the script. It just becomes a hodgepodge of all of these characters without really doing justice to any of them. And I don't think I would feel so negative about this, except for how much effort was put into taking the depositions verbatim from a social network and trying to project them as close to literally as possible in that film, and then in this kind of lazily summarizing some of the procedures here. And while I get it's a big, expansive trial, so was the multi-billion-dollar Facebook lawsuit. So what the fuck are we doing here? In a year that has such diversity, you have these two polar opposite stories in terms of promising young woman and Nomadland. Both are tales of female empowerment to an extent. Both are tales of people trying to find their identity in a cruel and unloving world. But thematically, they could not be any more different. Thematically, they could not be any more dramatically different. Promising Young Woman is a very stylized, music-heavy sort of filmatic, cinematic way to approach a very human story, whereas Nomadland is a very patient, quiet, controlled, and well-paced approach at something that is more about being a woman in America in a very different light. And both have their positives and their merits, right? Nomadland specifically it's a movie not just about a woman who leaves her no-horse town after becoming a widow to go out and explore the world from the back of her van, but it is a very human story about, especially in the time of COVID, feeling isolated and sometimes wondering what is in that isolation that we can learn from, what we can see in the void that stares back, right? Nomadland has a lot of moments where characters will explore why they wanted to be nomads. I think the movie's better when it shows it as opposed to when it has characters tell us why they made these decisions. But I think the moments of silence in the film, moreover, are opportunities for us to think about what value there is in exploring the quietness of isolation. What I mean by that specifically is it's a film that talks about sort of not just a rejection of societal norms, maybe gender norms, maybe family norms, what these people are once their bonds are broken, once their husbands pass away, once their kids grow up, but also a rejection of the things that really have pushed us apart as a people that were meant to unite us. So social network, mass information, mass transit, and a reversion to just the glory of traveling the country kind of off the radar by yourself. And there's something I think that's very relatable in that. And I think that while the film is a well-paced project that it many times reminds me of an Alexander Payne type of human story, like, kind of a road trip like a Sideways, or even just a character study like Nebraska, right? The movie is bound by the strength of its performances. And while at this point we all expect that from perennial Oscar nominee Frances McDormand, you also have some great performances by David Strathairn and also by real-life nomads like Linda May, Swanky, and Bob Wells, who appear kind of as themselves. Maybe that's another reason why I kind of felt the Alexander Payne comparison in this, because he often casts, for instance, real-life grocery store attendants to play grocery store attendants. But nevertheless, the film feels very authentic and genuine. Something, however, that stuck with me that I think in many ways embodies my takeaway from the movie is that while it is an exploration of the great outdoors and the world beyond our black mirrors, the film often does a lot to highlight lighting, sunrises, sunsets, to look at, the brightness of the world, but it often seems to desaturate, the greens of the world, desaturate the blues of the water, to become a kind of a bland palette. And I'm not sure if or why this was intentional, but in many ways, it's a resonant thought in that the movie to me does feel very brilliant and bright, and there is a lot of substance to it, but in many ways, it lacks a lot of the the worldliness, the connection to the world it really is seeking to explore. The benefit to this is, of course, you feel closer to your characters, but I think in many ways the takeaway and the negative aspect of this is it feels maybe a little bit shallow, like we're missing something. We're missing that ultimate connection the character is seeking for, and the character at times appears to find. And that's just a weird choice, but it doesn't take away from a great direction from Chloe Zhao, who I think is a promising young director who, unfortunately, next year is directing a fucking Marvel movie, so apparently she's earned her paycheck and some time off. But nevertheless, Nomadland it's exactly what you would expect it to be. If you've seen the trailer, you're gonna get what you expect. I think that there are a lot of people who can get something out of this, especially in, like I said, a time of COVID. But there was just maybe something at the very end that was missing for me to truly call it great. With Minari, I think we have an interesting contrast to many of the films we've already talked about here. I think one of the closest contrasts would be with Nomadland, in the sense that in a year that is so much about loss, for instance, in The Sound of Metal or in The Father, this and Nomadland are really about trying to find something, trying to find an identity. And while Nomadland sort of does it in a very existential and esoteric way by this woman leaving and traveling the world through her van, Minari takes a somewhat familiar story in the family risks everything to start a farm, and another somewhat familiar story in just the general American immigrant story, and blends them together into a really interesting menagerie of both. Obviously, it is bolstered by good performances by Steven Yeun, who at this point I think can do anything after seeing Minari and Burning a few years ago, which he was tragically ignored for by the Academy. But you also have opportunities for child actors to shine, which, as you probably know from watching these reviews, I typically loathe child performers, but this is continuing a trend in the last several years of an increasingly quality stock of youthful performers. And some veteran Hollywood character actors like Will Patton, one of our favorites here at Dauphine, who helps to pull together a very human script. What I mean by that specifically is not only are the characters empathetic and believable and relatable, but the world in which they live, which is, I guess, another contrast to the Trial of Chicago 7, right? The world in which they live feels complete. It makes their actions have meaning and rationale. It makes them feel like they belong where they are, and it allows us to feel passionate about decisions they make, about consequences to their actions, and about events that befall them as much as things that they provide energy to out in that story. Will Patton does a really good job of just taking just a veteran screen presence and toning down, or at least providing a consistency to the camp of his character where nothing really detracts from the story. It allows for it to have sort of a novel-like quality where you can have some bizarre side characters without them breaking the immersion of the story, feeling like they take away from characters, or feeling like the scenes are meant for them more than for a progression of the story. Again, back to Chicago 7. You can have some diversions into one character here or there, but largely, if you can't center in on the core human protagonists at the center of the story, you're not really telling much of a story itself. In many ways, I think it doesn't particularly matter if it's the best film of the year. I think what it delivers are some amazing performances and something that I think we needed in this past year, which is a very real, family, familiar kind of story that makes us forget for 2 hours that we're all kind of stuck inside alone ordering DoorDash. Now, ultimately, I've saved two of my favorites for last here. The first is going to be The Sound of Metal. And as I alluded to earlier, it is ultimately a film about loss, but more importantly, it's a journey to accepting loss. And I think what is most fascinating about The Sound of Metal is its authenticity. What I mean by that, of course, is that it is one of the first films to truly explore the deaf and hard of hearing culture. It's a culture that's largely been ignored and exploited by Hollywood, and one that I think has a lot more depth to it than a lot of people realize. Most films involving someone who's blind or deaf and hard of hearing would just be like Scent of a Woman. It's just an actor who is trying to pretend to be like somebody with a disability. Hoorah! Whereas Sound of Metal really is an exploration of what that disability is, or if it is a disability. The latter of which is a very complicated concept that many people who are hearing don't think about and struggle to understand, right? Sound of Metal really explores the idea of the deaf culture and how, if among that culture, people don't necessarily perceive that as a disability or a handicap. Now, this may seem counterintuitive, but we were in DC for a very long time filming projects for DHS and Gallaudet University, and something that we always noticed there was that idea that really challenged us, that the deaf and hard of hearing culture and community wasn't one born out of loss or born out of handicap and disability, but just another culture, another way of living. And this movie acknowledges that, accepts that, embraces that, and communicates that most effectively to people who wouldn't know that, wouldn't expect that, and wouldn't normally understand that. It does the opposite of what Mank did, right? It tells a compelling and engaging story around informing the audience of an entirely different world. And it feels as authentic as it attempts to be. And that could not be possible except for that the director was impacted by a very similar story when his grandmother suddenly went deaf when he was younger. That genuine human story is translated into film so well here through a very empathetic character played by Riz Ahmed and trained by Paul Raci, who was also raised in a deaf household, in such a genuine capacity that it doesn't feel kind of like a Rain Man where we're sensationalizing something. It really feels like a journey into another world, and that is ultimately what film is supposed to be about. Now, these great performances and this great depth and exploration into the world, they would be good by themselves, but what makes Sound of Metal, to me at least, so interesting is the fact that the film translates this ultimate, education into the deaf and hard of hearing community through its narrative. Although the character is being told that he needs to accept that he is now deaf, although the character is being told that he needs to acclimate to this new community and that he's welcome there, he's constantly trying to think of ways to save up money for a surgery, to have an implant so that he can get what he thinks hearing is back, and ultimately to try to become normal again. And by the end of the movie is faced with the question of what it means to accept his new normal and whether or not he can ever be happy again. It's asking a very human question that maybe we don't want to explore ourselves. What would I feel like if I lost my hearing? But ultimately are incredibly, inherently human stories that are worthy of being told. And I think not just for the performances, not just for the quality of the sound effects or the scripting or the pacing, but just for the ingenuity and for having the ability to really explore this world for the first time in cinema. This is a truly fantastic film that I can't recommend enough. Hey, speaking of depressing movies, it's The Father with Anthony Hopkins, Olivia Colman, Olivia Williams, pretty much all of the Olivias in Hollywood today, and Rufus Sewell. The Father is probably a film you feel like you've seen before in the sense that it's about a man who's entering dementia and his whole world is becoming a sort of Charlie Kaufman-esque maze of time and space around him. But while the story is in many ways familiar, the way it's told is inherently different. As I did allude to moments ago, yeah, it does have a bit of that Charlie Kaufman vibe to it, a little bit of Synecdoche, New York, where Philip Seymour Hoffman is beginning to lose grips of reality, and time is now a very fluid concept that we lose track of. The Father is a very grounded, I would say, if Synecdoche, New York is like the science fiction equivalent, this is like the hard science fiction equivalent, where though the narrative is not what we would consider to be linear, it's still a very understandable progression that seems to be consistent with how we would understand dementia or largely just kind of losing grips on reality slowly and progressively. In that sense, it never feels to be melodramatic or sensationalist. Much like Sound of Metal, it feels like a real exploration into the mind and struggles of an individual, in this case Anthony Hopkins, but more importantly through the struggles his family encounters around him. In many ways, the tragedy of this film is so impactful because it's not woe is Anthony Hopkins, although that part does come at the end, and it is majestic and probably one of my favorite Hopkins performances. But it's a tragedy that affects everybody, from Olivia Colman, the daughter, to Imogen Poots, who I don't want to say too much about, to Olivia Williams, who has a wonderful performance as several different people. It's a movie about, at its core, trying to be the best you can in an unwinnable situation, and how that brings out the most human components of us and also the most animalistic and cruel components of us. Whether you're an apparent victim like Anthony Hopkins or you're just a bystander, that is the strength of this movie. And I think, again, in a year of loss, it is one thing to put out art about losing something. That is sad in and of itself, and we can all relate to the feeling of, oh, I have lost my hearing. Oh, I have lost my sense of place and my mind. Where is my mind? But to really explore the impacts of that loss, to really humanize that loss, and to go beyond the base level of making us feel sad watching somebody go deaf, watching somebody lose their mind, and force us to integrate into that world, empathize with complex characters, and see the world through new eyes. That's something that I think has never been challenged as much as it has in this year's batch of films, with The Father being a great example and The Sound of Metal being another. I do want to say a couple things before I decide what wins the Dauphine Academy Award. Mank is one of my least favorite movies to get nominated in the last several years. I think you could probably get that clue from how I described it. Trial of the Chicago 7 is also right up there. If I had to knock both of them out and put two more in, because for some reason now we need 8 nominees, I would go ahead and say that if we're going for a historical docudrama, I would much prefer seeing One Night in Miami. I think it's got fantastic performances. Regina King does a wonderful job as a director in that project. And it just a compelling story that's unlike Mank or The Trial of Chicago 7. Fun, cohesive, informative, and overall just memorable. Memorable. You can remember it. The other film, of course, that I would put in there, which I think it's kind of a tragedy it didn't get nominated. It's nominated for Best Foreign Film, but that's not good enough for me, man. Another Round, which is one of my favorite pictures in the last several years. It is a wonderfully depressing story about a handful of individuals, friends in their 40s, who want to explore this theory that humans were born with a .004 or 005 alcohol blood content deficiency, and thus try to remain buzzed perpetually to very expected sad endings. It's a fun movie. It's a very human movie, which I think has been the trend this year. I don't know how many times I've said human, but I think that's something that's been very resonant after the last year or so. And it's one that I think really deserved to be nominated way more than fucking Mank. Anywho's, enough about that. I want to say that it's been definitely a wild ride this past year throughout COVID, trying to stay up with new movies. And it has been a pleasure seeing new movies in whatever avenue we can, whether digitally or in outdoor screenings. And ultimately, yeah, I think this crop probably is the result of a year in which many films didn't get to see a release or many films were held back. But nevertheless, there were some gems in there. Ultimately, of the 8 given to us by the Academy in their infinite wisdom, I gotta go with The Sound of Metal for Best Picture. And with that, we'll be back at you next week with brand new reviews, starting with the Bob Odenkirk opus. I wanted to say opus. Bob Odenkirk opus. Nobody.